Usually Living House channels for educational purposes only is not intended as financial advice. It's Friday, prices are down. Massive governance debate going on right now in Bitcoin land for those who are connected. So I wanted to do a video on Drivechains from my perspective for those who have no clue what's going on. Maybe provide a simple explanation and definition, pros and cons, and why some people are very concerned with BIP300. I myself am certainly extremely cautious when we're changing the Bitcoin code and the fundamentals and all that. So my default position is always going to be, let's not do that thing. So what is BIP300? What are Drivechains? It's a way to peg Bitcoin in and out of a sidechain of a layer 2. How it would work is you'd come up with an idea, let's say it's an ICO, let's say it's a privacy tech, let's say it's something that no one's ever heard of, that's the best thing since sliced bread. Could be anything you want. You propose it. 90% of the miners over the next 2 weeks would have to approve it, and the funds are placed in an escrow basically for the sidechain. The benefits here obviously would be you're using Bitcoin, you're staying on Bitcoin. We're not pushing people who want to develop things on Bitcoin elsewhere. Originally, for those who don't know, Vitalik wanted to create a type of Ethereum on Bitcoin and just couldn't, so he created Ethereum. So some of this logic applies where we want to be a big tent. We want to invite all types of people to create all sorts of permissionless innovation and work on the Bitcoin code and stay here versus pushing them away into bigger blocks or smart contracts or NFTs. We want people to be able to do that on Bitcoin. That's one argument. So for BIP300, the sidechain does whatever it wants. It can have any consensus mechanism it wants. It can have trust issues, no trust issues. It can be a stable coin. It can be a security. It can be anything it wants, right? And then if you want to come out of that sidechain, you basically have an ask transaction where you want to take your funds out to a specific address, similar to Lightning, you know how you go in and out of Lightning for those who are aware. And then the miners would essentially confirm that with a lag, the suggested lag being 3 to 6 months. Months with an M. And then they would release those transactions back to the layer 1 from the layer 2 if they are legit. Now, what I fail to understand here, okay, just as a practical example, which is maybe part of my aversion to something like Drivechains. Let's say we have 1 BTC, we exchange it for 500 shitcoin, and at the end of 2 years, we say, you know what, we want that 1 BTC back, but the value of 500 shitcoins has fluctuated. Do I get the 1 BTC back? I'm assuming not. I could be wrong, but part of the problem with BIP300 is it's seemingly overly complex, and Paul is an interesting guy. I like Paul. I like Luke. We'll get to that at the very end. But Paul is kind of abrasive and has an interesting personality. And that's part of this whole issue. So just bullet points, basic functionality. He calls it hash rate escrows in the BIP. It would be a soft fork where you'd bridge from Bitcoin to another layer 2, similar to Lightning. There would be a maximum of 256 sidechains. Why this number, I'm not exactly sure. I'm sure he's talked about it somewhere. He's got a ton of stuff out there, by the way. I'll have all the links in the presentation, in the speaker's notes, so I'll post that in the description of the video. And miners would decide winners and losers here. If I'm a miner and I want fees, something I haven't talked about yet, but if I'm a miner and want the fees of the sidechain of the layer 2, then I'm approving everything at the end of the day. Why wouldn't I, right? What do I care? That's more of a con than maybe anything, but I have a self-interest in approving a sidechain so that I can get more fees. This allows for the minting of coins on a sidechain using Bitcoin. Okay, we validate the sidechain using Bitcoin's proof of work. That isn't to say that the consensus inside of the sidechain is validated, just that peg mechanism. Creation somewhat instant, and then the redemption would be a time lag. So some visual aids from Paul, his Twitter, I stole these directly. This is the vanilla system we have now, right? We have users who pay transaction fees to miners. Miners collect that transaction fee. That is part of the total revenue along with the block reward. This is how he says non-MEV, this is a concern. Transaction reordering, we're basically potentially altering miner incentives, corrupting miners completely for a different priority. That is definitely a concern, but this is his example where miners are not only collecting transaction fees from layer 1 now, but they're collecting transaction fees from layer 2. Another big problem with Drivechains, which I'll get to, because the node itself, he has this small Drivechain full node cost will be $3. casually. Because the layer 2 full nodes won't necessarily be ran by the layer 1 node people, like for instance me. If I don't care about this drive chain or drive chains at all, I'm not going to expend extra energy cost, hardware cost to keep this thing running. It's in the interest of the layer 2 users to keep that running. Now we know, let's take a few examples. Ripple, a few others where there is no incentive to run a node, and those nodes have to be propped up basically by the chain itself, not through proof of stake, but through subsidies essentially from Ripple, either indirect or direct. And you can see this on Ripple's chain, for example. So you're very likely introducing a bunch of centralized chains at the end of the day, inevitably. This is very likely. Now, that isn't necessarily a con against drive chains themselves, but if we're enabling drive chains and no one's going to use them, we're just enabling an attack surface. Again, another con, that why bother? Why are we just adding attack vectors when we don't need to? Some would say that's too pessimistic, that we want permissionless innovation. For every 10 good ideas, we may see 10,000 bad ideas, but those 10 good ideas would be worth it. Okay, I'm getting way ahead of myself, but in any event, this is like the ideal utopia scenario. We have a vibrant layer 2, there's fees, miners are paid, happy days, right? Now this is his example of what ETH is currently, which is just, a massive cluster of MEV dark forest shenanigans where users are losing out, they're paying more, kind of what's going on in ETH now, right? I mean, let's be honest. And again, if you don't know what MEV is, just think of transaction reordering, kind of like arbitrage, kind of like an on-chain way to find a more efficient way to make a transaction to your benefit, and then you take the difference basically. And again, there are bots that automatically do this to maximize validator rewards, that sort of thing. And here's his example where, again, it's this overly rosy scenario that miners are just going to keep doing what they're doing. They're not going to pay attention to MEV. They're not going to pay attention to this newfound cash crop over here where they can just align themselves towards collecting the most fees from the layer 2. They're going to continue mining as if nothing ever happened. So again, if drive chains are centralized, who cares? That's on layer 2. We don't care, right? If users get scammed, we don't care. This is a libertarian ideal. Let them lose their money. If this is some sort of attack on Bitcoin, who cares? It's going to happen. Let's build antibodies. Let's do it. These are all part of the current narrative. And this dream of miners not noticing why they're getting more money is hilarious. So why do we need drive chains at all? There's a concern. I wouldn't call it growing, large or small. It's always been there, as maybe Nick Carter calls it real FUD, where transaction fees would be inadequate over the long term. I'll get to this at the end as well. To pay for Bitcoin's security budget, transaction fees in a bear market, as we know, are nearly non-existent. But as I'll show some examples, transaction fees for most things in a bear market are non-existent. This would encourage Bitcoin dominance, hyper-Bitcoinization, right? We're building on Bitcoin. Isn't Bitcoin awesome? We're just going to steal all the best technology from all the altcoins, just create Zcash on Bitcoin, Monero on Bitcoin, Tornado Cash on Bitcoin, and no one will need anything else because we have the ability to do it all here, and it would keep people inside the ecosystem. Now let's get to some of the concerns. I borrowed this from things around the internet, by the way. Again, all of the sources are in the description of the slides, but Michael Tidwell put together a great list. Here's some of the stuff from that list. First argument, nobody wants it. We've had all sorts of stuff that no one's really cared about. No one's used, no one's continued to use. Tether just announced they're not supporting Omni anymore the other day. You may have not even heard of some of this stuff. Counterparty would be Pepe stuff. Liquid's more of a blockstream thing. Taro is, as my understanding, has the ability to create stable coins on the Lightning Network, for example. Ordinals and BRC20 happened just the other day, so most people are aware of that, where there was this big debate. Is this spam? Should this be allowed? This is just shitcoining NFTs, promoting scams. And the microcosm of that debate, or rather that debate, represents this greater debate where do we want people building things on Bitcoin, or do we want to be the best hard money? That happened through Taproot, by the way, Ordinals, which most people didn't really understand fully what would happen with Taproot. Not to say that it shouldn't have been approved, but there are certainly unknown unknowns with approving drive chains. This elsewhere first argument, Paul's had, I'm going to be hyperbolic and say a decade, but he's had a long time to write the code, build the code, test it elsewhere, and it has been tested-ish elsewhere. But one of the reasons why SegWit was such a slam dunk is because it was added to Litecoin, it was tested in the wild with consequences, and it was found to not have any major flaws. I haven't personally seen that with Drivechains. That isn't to say you can't use Liquid and fork something and do it yourself and blah, blah, blah. That's not what we're talking about. Me personally, I want to see it fully tested with miners in the wild. We don't test in production on Bitcoin. We never have. This isn't ETH. We don't want rollbacks. That just destroys a lot of the purity that Bitcoin has at the moment, right? And like I already said, we're altering miner incentives. We've got this MEV problem. We're encouraging chain reorgs potentially. If some layer 2 has massive fees all of a sudden, miners could be incentivized to maximize for that fee gain, right? So you're changing potentially the incentives for the miners, period. Then there's this whole DPEG problem where you can think over a weekend we have a stablecoin who loses banking, drop below $1, and unless there's somebody on the other side of that equation, if a layer 2 fails, for example, if we have a drive chain that fails, Paul's answer would be, well, that's on the people who put the money in. That's on them. It's their fault. Scams happen. Okay. That's an angle, I guess, but that isn't a place I want to be. I don't want the regulatory risk. I don't want the headline risk. I don't want to be a part of the chain where that happens. I don't want to be on the chain that has something like an algorithmic stablecoin on a layer 2, right? And the anti-drive chain people always bring these negative examples up because they've happened and almost guarantee they're going to happen again. So layer 2 is failing, you're scrambling to exit, and there's this 3 to 6 month lag. Who maintains that peg? Nobody, right? It just crumbles and falls apart. Something else that's not on this list, miners can steal. Miners are ineffectively custodians in this case. So all of a sudden we're trusting them with consensus and custody. And again, Paul's retort to that is, well, if that happens, then all the drive chains are going to shrink and the market forces will take hold and people will learn their lesson. Okay. Sure, that's one way. We can be Portugal. We can say, you know what, all drugs are legal. Let's do it. I'm actually very pro that argument for drugs, period, versus the drug war. But when we're talking about Bitcoin and hard money, I'm very anti-Portugal mentality, which maybe is conflicting or inconsistent, but that's just how I feel. There's another argument that if we enable this and we have a 256 sidechains, that the fees won't even be high enough to matter. I'll get to that in a second. The adoption is dangerous angle is basically the same as the DPEG angle. If the sidechain gets big enough, the bounty just continues to increase for a miner to do something or someone in the ecosystem to do something. And if a layer 2 blows up and all of a sudden we've got egg on our face as a layer 1, right? And then there's an argument that Luke makes, which is the people who want shitcoins are gone. They're using other chains. They've been using other chains for years. That ship has sailed, right? Matt Corello talks about Stratum V2. I'm not even going to bring that up in this conversation, but he's probably right in regards to mining security. And then Luke also talks about just basically using what we have in existence for this type of behavior, use key citing federation. That's back to the argument that some people say, look, we have enough stuff here already. Let's try to maximize the tech we have rather than just keep adding things on. This is, Paul's dream of we're just going to absorb everything. And for many years, I've said, look, Zcash could just be a sidechain or an ICO or whatever, right? This is, of course, from Spirited Away, but yeah, theoretically, we could just absorb everything. That's, best case scenario. So here's a look at the current fee generation for ETH, BTC, and a few other chains. And I'll look at the Bitcoin fees specifically, but a lot of this is Uniswap. A lot of this is DEXs. So that's something we could do with a sidechain, certainly, in Ethereum's case. And this will change from time to time, fees in a bull market. No one's worried about fees in a bull market. It's how are we going to maintain a fee market when there's little transactional activity, essentially, pushing fees higher? How are we going to maintain that security budget? And Satoshi's even said there's either going to be robust transactions or there's going to be nothing. So he was very well aware of that in the beginning. And the problem with layer 2s is if we push everything to a layer 2, Lightning is a good example of this. If we push all of the activity to layer 2, then all of a sudden there's no fees or value accrual for layer 1. I'd argue that's a problem for Ethereum right now. Certainly a problem for a lot of these layer 1s where there isn't even enough activity on a layer 1 for layer 2 right now to make sense. Like, who cares, right? There's no activity on the layer 1. Why do we need a layer 2? That isn't an anti drive chain argument, but it's just a, we don't need this if no one's even using it argument. Here's an example. Okay, Avalanche. Now, Avalanche is not Bitcoin. That's not to say that we can't have an amazing killer use case that doesn't exist yet on a layer 2 on Bitcoin. These are just examples, okay? So if we look at Avalanche, it's kind of segregated into C-chain, X-chain, P-chain. They've got subnets, which are basically sidechains. Now, they do have proof of stake incentives. They can create coins on subnets. I'm just explaining this for people who have no clue what I'm talking about. But here's like a potential example, right? So the layer 1 would be C-chain. The layer 2 would be the subnets. Yes, we're seeing a ton of activity, have seen a ton of activity on the subnets. That's declined significantly. The subnets themselves have been things like games or kind of like silly, non-important, in my mind, right? Type things, but that doesn't really matter. They're generating transactions, which are generating fees, which are keeping people here. It doesn't matter that maybe some of them have been Ponzi-like or have been scams. But in a bear market, we are seeing a massive decline in the subnets. And if we look at the fees, this is from basically 2023 to present. There was a small uptick in fees, right? But fees are down considerably. Now, I don't know why Avalanche isn't on this list, but it would be up here, basically, top 5, top 6 in layer 1s. So here's an example of something we already have that's generating very little fees with a similar concept. Okay, now here's another example. Let's talk about Polkadot. Very similar. Instead of sort of miners deciding who would get a sidechain, they basically had this sidechain auction where the slots were paid for by kind of like an ICO, and whoever raised the most money would get that sidechain. But at the end of the day, again, in a bear market, nobody's using this stuff. Nobody cares. It matters a lot in a bull market when you can drum up support and ICO and do all this stuff. But we can't maintain those fees, that fee market, in a bear market. Here's a layer 2, Lightning, where we do have decent activity. Now, Wallet of Satoshi is centralized. There are issues there, but they do have a considerable amount of payment activity. Even on Lightning, if you're unaware, base fees are fees that are routed through a channel. Fees to peers in the same channel, there are none, right? So fees are extremely low on the Lightning Network, and that's great for that type of transaction. And if we look at the fee rate's still pretty low. All this is just to say, look, there's even a period on Lightning that people are using now, today, not perfect, there are issues, where fees just go to zero. So the fees, that argument may not be good enough to generate a security budget, basically, right? Now here's ordinals. Ordinals are the NFT stuff that happened. Now there is a lot of transactional activity, but fees have gone essentially to zero. There's still some baseline fee activity there, but this is a classic issue with most altcoins. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of initial, that's cool, let's try it out. Or there's some sort of ICO or some sort of auction, false time constraint where people want to sign up for something quickly, fees go super high, and then it sort of peters out, right? Do I care that ordinals are on the chain? I don't. Do I care that NFTs are on the chain, that it exists? It doesn't matter to me, right? I'll tell you where it matters in a second, but here's another example. Here's Base. Okay, this is the Coinbase thing. Fees thus far have came and went. We don't have a lot of data on this, but again, these are examples of sort of what you'd expect, I think, on Drivechains, where we see activity peak up. There's a bunch of stuff we can do, awesome, and then it sort of peters out, right? Unless we're doing something like Tornado Cash, or we're mixing, or we're doing something with privacy, I think that has a shot at actually maintaining a fee budget over a longer period of time. Even a DEX would have that. And that's, you see that on Ethereum, right? You see those fees extremely high for the DEXs on Ethereum. Here's Friendtech, okay? I'm just giving you examples. Now, this isn't necessarily a reason not to enable Drivechains. It's a reality check in saying, look, the fees probably are not even going to matter at the end of the day. Friendtech was huge, peaked up, boom, right down, right? Again, nobody cares. There's all this Ponzi-nomics stuff involved, or buy low, sell high. There was this promise of all these creators are going to come in and use it. And that may happen one day, but in a bear market thus far, it's came and went. Rootstock, here's an example that Checkmatey of Glassnode brought up. If we put something like Rootstock on a layer 2, there'd be a 1 to 3% uptick in the fee revenue, not the total revenue, just in the fee revenue. So it may not even be good enough. So there's a lot of negatives. Let's talk about some pros here. What could we build? Just the other day, Brian of Coinbase put out a list of things that people could build. Realistically, he wants it on base, he may not have said that, he may not think that, but at the end of the day, they benefit from people building on their chain at this point. And there's a whole list of cool stuff, and I'm not saying we can't have cool stuff on Drivechains. We totally could, but it's unlikely that, based on what we've seen, that the fees would be generative enough to maintain that security budget in a bear market. And here's another, retort from Jameson. You also hear from Paul saying, look, if we would have stopped building the internet at the first two intranets, then we wouldn't have the internet, right? And just because we're pointing out a decade of failures doesn't mean we haven't found the good drive chain yet, right? Or the good side chain yet. That's fair. Back to the ordinals for a second in relation to the fees, right? One of the pros from the ordinal people were that, we might be increasing block size and that may centralize the network, but at the end of the day, we're getting all these fees, right? Well, that didn't last. And now we have all the bloat without the benefit, okay? And here's another retort from Jameson saying, we can't be worried about unknowns. We must push forward. We must innovate. We must, I normally agree with Jameson, but I think a lot of people are just hand waving the risks and saying, look, well, yeah, of course there are risks, but we can't just stop building. We need to continue to innovate. I just think a lot of people are rightfully extremely cautious. And here's, the retort for layer 2's failing. And again, Paul would say, well, that's not a reason to not enable drive chains. But layer 2's inevitably would be centralized. That isn't a promise. That isn't a guarantee. But from what we've seen on the ETH side of things, and I'm throwing shade at Infura here, throwing shade at ETH itself, where most of the nodes are hosted. They're not, individual people. It's on Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud, whatever else. And at the end of the day, we have time to figure this out. For some reason, there's just like this week been this urgency, this time constraint of we must figure this out now. We must hurry up. I think that's because it was brought up by Luke. I'll get to that in a second. But this may be an issue. We can continue thinking about it. We can continue looking at the code, finding ways to protect users, potentially doing something, versus just saying, oh, well, we can't wait. We looked at this for years. This needs to be on the chain now. We need to let people innovate. We're losing to altcoins. We've got plenty of time from a security budget perspective, unless price goes to zero, right? Then we may be in trouble, but there's still a block reward. There will continue to be a block reward for quite some time. Now, will that be enough? That's the question. There will be a critical point somewhere in here where if the fees get too low, then we risk a 51% attack or this chain security is null and void. I mean, we may have drive chains and fees may be low enough and we get 51% attacked anyway, right? So I certainly like talking about this and thinking about it and heading it off at the pass, but I don't think there's this urgency all of a sudden that we need to do this right now. One other thing people are bringing up, I'm not really like big into the conspiracy theory type mindset, but Paul has a company, Layer 2 Labs. They raised the money at the end of last year, specifically for this purpose of bringing drive chains to the network. And like I mentioned, Luke brought the code forth with the BIP. That's one way to get things talking and get things moving. And that's certainly what's happened this week. Something that Paul and both Luke have admitted, I guess, is that, they were financially supporting Luke doing this, even though Luke doesn't think it's a good idea. So this gets back to how do we pay developers? If developers can be corrupted and influenced, not saying that this is what's happening, but you're getting paid to introduce something you don't agree with, that is certainly a risk, a weakness in the system. And there are a bunch of, this is from Paul again, there are a bunch of other issues and concerns that people bring up that for the most part, based on the spaces I've sat in for the past 2 days, Paul sort of hand waves and says, either this won't be a problem, it's not a problem, or it's not my problem, right? Like legitimizing scams. So look, all I want us to do is think twice, cut once. We don't want to open a Pandora's box. We don't want to build empty cathedrals. Do we really want Portugal on Bitcoin is the question. Maybe hyperbolic, but it's one way to think about it. And I actually also agree with the Constitutional Convention, which is every 100 years. This is a Ralph Nader proposal. Every 100 years, we essentially rebuild and rewrite the Constitution. Bitcoin maxis kind of act like we shouldn't do anything. We shouldn't change anything. The Bible is the Bible. It's a literal interpretation. And it's funny because I'm not like that in real life at all. But I do feel like that with Bitcoin because we don't get a second shot at this. So hopefully this helped bring up some of the pros and cons with drive chains and help you understand what's going on here. Let me know what you think in the comments. Most people are going to completely disagree with me. They're going to say drive chains are great. We should have had these years ago. But it's definitely something to think about. from a Bitcoin fundamental perspective, and it's an interesting debate. That's all this one. Like, dislike, comment, share, subscribe, and happy trading.